Welcome back to Criminology. Now in this chapter we're going to be exploring the theory of social conflict theory. Now this is going to be done in two parts. Part 1 in this week and part 2 in next week. Now it's kind of important here, to note that the term conflict, it's a familiar word to us, but it's not an unnatural experience in anybody's life and can and does exist in many forms. We can experience interpersonal conflict with friends and family. However, we can also experience this at a community or a neighborhood level or even at a city level. Conflict is everywhere. However, conflict is not just one-sided. That is to say, conflict doesn't mean only bad. Consider stress. Where there is distress or bad stress, then there's stress, that's the benign stress. If you breathe out, you build a little stress in your body that says, inhale please, inhale. And then there is good stress or eustress. Now conflict can be bad, it also can be neutral, it can be even good. Now good would be that's the kind of conflict that creates enough disturbance to motivate you rather than to frighten you. In criminology, and in particular in social conflict theories, conflict here is between the social structures, and we talked about social structures in the social structure theories. That's like the circumstances, the economy, the political world, education, healthcare, these are social structures. So it's the stuff that's between social structures that make up the rich and the poor. Now, this perspective is also known in criminology as critical criminology. Now, the critical criminology as a term is going to be used by us as an umbrella term to refer to a number of theories that are based on the idea that crime is a result of social conflict. Now, this is a departure from some of our other theories, and so it's got a lot of history to it in sociology, and we'll get into a wee bit of that in this particular chapter. Critical criminologists do consider issues like racism, sexism, imperialism, unsafe work conditions, things like inadequate childcare, substandard housing, pollution to the environment, and poverty as being the most serious crimes, as they create the conditions in society that lead to people feeling desperate, maybe even turning to drugs or alcohol abuse and violence as a way of dealing with that disparity. Now this is, as I mentioned, a little departure from our other theories, as social conflict theories consider the inequity in society, and that one group, the haves, can and do influence or even control the social structures that others, in particular the have-nots, depend on. Now you can look in the news and you can probably see a lot of experiences like that, and I would ask in this particular chapter that you do, because certainly in the US politics, a lot of this philosophy seems to be playing out before our eyes on TV and in the news. But you can also see this in different parts of the world. Conflict theory does not attempt to explain crime. It simply identifies the social conflicts that, as basic facts of life and as a source of discriminatory treatment by the criminal justice system of groups and classes that lack the power and lack the status of those who make and enforce the laws. And so that puts an unequal playing field in the play for many citizens. So conflict theorists anticipate a guided evolution, not revolution, to improve the existing criminal justice system. In this chapter, we're going to explore the social conflict theories put forth by critical criminologists, the perspective and reaction to the unequal distribution of power and wealth in a society. Now you can see by the image excuse me, that I've put up beside me, it's also in your textbook, that there are a number of critical criminology branches. Now, our textbook will be using the term critical criminology, as I mentioned, as an umbrella term, which will include the radical Marxist criminology. That's going back historically from a sociological perspective, but attaching itself to some newer things criminologically, and the emerging forms of social conflicts theory that we'll get into in part 2, left realism, critical feminism, power and control theory, and peacemaking theories. Okay, so let's start with the conflict theory of crime. Now, as you will see in this chapter, conflict theory, as I've mentioned earlier, has had an earlier beginning than some. Then when, it really came into focus in the 60s. And it was in the 60s when society was experiencing many different social upheavals. Now, I'm from the 60s, and some of this makes sense and I remember about this. Many of you may not. The challenging way that things were back then, such movements as the anti-Vietnam War demonstrations, the second wave of the women's movement, the counterculture movements. In the 60s, that was the hippies. The assassinations of John F. Kennedy as president, Robert Kennedy as a senator, his brother, Martin Luther King Jr., Watergate. All of this was happening in the 60s and the early part of the 70s, and even in Canada. You may not be aware of this, but the formation of a terrorist group known as the Front de Libération du Québec, or the FLQ, they were responsible for a series of bombings in Montreal, kidnappings, even the murder of 2 individuals who were had political positions, one in Canada and one in Britain, I think it was. All accumulating in what was known as, this was known in the 70s as the October Crisis. Now this period, it gave much ability for conflict theorists to study how and in what ways do social structures or the social divisions get supported and strengthened. Criminological researchers Chambly and Seidman, they suggested that justice systems protect the rich and the powerful. They promote some common objectives. That is, they being Chambly and Seidman. They had some common objectives. One was to describe how the control of the police and the economic systems affect the way that the criminal justice system is administered. 2, showing how definitions of crime favor those who control the justice system. And then 3, to analyze the role of conflict in the contemporary society to see what roles it's playing. Now finally, Chambly and Seidman forwarded another objective of conflict theory, and that is that the justice is skewed. Now you have to remember, this is back in the 60s, 70s, and so these sorts of awarenesses are relatively new. Those who may commit a crime out of economic necessity, that's how it's skewed. It could be skewed in terms of biases, that those who commit crime out of the economic necessity, the poor who need, they will rob, thieve, or drug deals as a way of making some money to make ends meet, and receive more severe sanctions than those who need less protection, but they receive more. That's the rich. Now this introduces a really important term in conflict theory. The term is power. From a social conflict perspective, one must first acknowledge this underlying principle of this view, which is that crime is ultimately defined by those in power. In a capitalist system, that's what we live in, a capitalist system, those in power, those who therefore ultimately provide all the definitions of what is a crime, what is criminal behavior, and what should be appropriate for criminal sanctions, are those who are the owners of the means of productions, or the haves. Now this is coming out of Karl Marx' perspective. Now Karl Marx was influential in sociology. In the 60s, the Marxist perspective started to emerge to explain this social inequity that occurred. So as a result of this myriad of definitions being provided by one powerful group, there will necessarily be inequity in the application, the administration, and the enforcement of laws that result when they are applied differently to the haves, the affluent, and the have-nots, the lower classes of society. And that's a hallmark of conflict theory, is this unequal distribution of who owns and who has to work for those who own, and the results of that. Now you can review the news every day and see examples of this. Racism, the disparaging of the poor, the homeless, indigenous and immigrant issues. This includes what is known as racial profiling. Now you can check out on page, I think it's 176, The Skin We're In. Now the social reality of crime, this was coined by conflict theorist Richard Quinney, where he aimed to integrate the concepts of power, society, and criminality into one theory. Now Quinney, he suggested that the criminal law represents the interest of those who hold power in society. Therefore, those who hold the power create the laws to benefit themselves and hold their opposition in check. Now, the research that supports the conflict theory, or at least has been done by conflict theory, research has been mostly focused and has been on the social conflict position to explore how social inequity forces people to commit crimes such as theft, break and enter, and prostitution as a means of survival economically. Now, crimes such as assault, drug use, homicides are seen as expressions of rage, frustration, and anger. The research suggests that one's, my income level or my low-income housing and relative economic deprivation are common measures of social inequality. Because they exist in society all the time, this disparity is part of the explanation for criminality. Class bias has always been addressed. For example, research indicates that police may act more forcibly in an environment of high social conflict, and therefore perceived as needing more forceful or larger numbers of officers on site to deal with. The approach compared to crime in more affluent areas doesn't respond typically in that way. So the research is also focused on the criminal courts, as they too are more likely to punish disenfranchised, powerless groups than they are the affluent. Now this could include disproportionate number of single, young, urban male, are the characteristics of what they call the dangerous class. So some of that profiling is based on those conditions. Conflict theorists also consider how the justice system acts quickly when the crime is toward the wealthy, white and male, and not as interested when the victim is poor, indigenous, black, or female. Now consider the large number of unsolved indigenous women murders in Canada that are still unsolved. If that number were of any other demographic group, that might not have been that long in waiting for the results. Now we can begin exploring the foundation of conflict theory by looking at the first group that sort of looked at developing a theory sociologically, the radical theory or the Marxist theory. They are interchangeable. Karl Marx, who was instrumental, Marx analyzed the struggle between the capitalist class and the working class. Now bear in mind, Marxist, when he was coming up with these thoughts, that's going back to about the 1830s, 1840s. So that distribution was very clear and very pronounced. Even though Marx did not write concerning crime specifically, however, his work has influenced many other thinkers And as I had mentioned earlier, the 60s was a fertile landscape to research into conflicting social structures, economic struggles, and the evolving society. The radical conflict theory took advantage when Ian Taylor, Paul Walton, and Jock Young published the New Criminology. This publication became very influential in the study of criminology as well as the existing legal system. Now in the 80s, the 1980s, the left realism and peacemaking movements and the feminists began to analyze the relationship between gender, power, and criminality. Now, some of the fundamentals of radical Marxist theory. If we were to look at Marxism, Marxism tries to explain crime within economic and social contexts to describe the connection among social class, crime, and social control. This is accomplished by focusing on how the capitalist state uses laws and criminal justice systems to control lower class societies. Now, Marx identified the wealthy and powerful owners of factories and commerce, and he used the term bourgeoisie. This was the capitalist class, and they owned and controlled the means of productions. He labeled the oppressed poor and working class as the proletariat, the working class. They must sell their labor because they have no other means to earn a livelihood. Now when this process of the haves and have-not carries out over time, another term emerged that Marx had introduced, and it was known as alienation. Exploited workers feel a sense of powerlessness and engage in estrangement from other people and even from themselves. And this alienation, keeps people down from Marx's perspective. Now, Marx believed that society should not just be studied, but should also be changed because the status quo is oppressive to most members of society. Now, in Marx's perspective, revolution will result from workers becoming aware of their own alienation and rise up and change the system. Revolution is Marx's concept for his time. Evolution of society is more of the contemporary position. It's not as demonstrative, and it's more process. Now, from Marx's perspective, the proletariat, or the poor, commit what we know as street crimes. This would be theft, B&E, and murder. Another group was termed the petite bourgeoisie. This would be the middle class. They would engage in things like employee theft, cheating on their taxes, taking things from the place that you work, petty corporate crime. Then the bourgeoisie, or the wealthy, they do what are known as sweet crimes. Now, not sweet as in S-W-E-E-T, but sweet as in S-U-I-T-E. So they're engaged in things like the perpetuation of racism, sexism, stock market manipulation, destruction of the environment, and profiteering. Sounds a little familiar if you look at some of the news that's going around in the last few years. Okay, now this was part one. This brings us to the end of part one. Now in part two, it'll be a little longer, but we're going to pick up from where we've left off, and we'll start with looking at the instrumental and structural Marxism, and then we're going to move into more contemporary forms where we'll be looking at this umbrella of critical criminology and look at the left realism, critical feminism, power and control theory, and peacemaking criminology. And then we'll tie it all up with a little segment on, as we do in most of these chapters, restorative justice. All right. Well, everybody, we're moving right along very well, and don't forget, we have an assignment coming up. Bye for now.